Jewish adaptations. Surely, Judaism is more than the history of anti-Semitism. Surely Jews deserve to be defined, and are in fact defined, by others as well as by themselves, by those qualities of faith, lineage, sacred texts, and moral teachings that have enabled them to endure through centuries of persecution. Gertrude Himmelfarb. 1. Larger than might be expected from their numbers. Jews constitute 0.2% of the world's population, but won 14% of Nobel Prizes in the first half of the 20th century, despite social discrimination and the Holocaust, and 29% in the second. As of 2007, Jews had won an amazing 32% of Nobel Prizes awarded in the 21st century. In many spheres of life, Jews have made contributions that are far. Jews have excelled not only in science but also in music, Mendelssohn, Mahler, Schoenberg, in painting, Pissarro, Modigliani, Rothko, and in philosophy, Maimonides, Bergson, Wittgenstein. Jewish authors have won the Nobel Prize in Literature for writing in English, French, German, Russian, Polish, Hungarian, Yiddish, and Hebrew. Such achievement requires an explanation, and the best and simplest is that Jews have adapted genetically to a way of life that requires higher than usual cognitive capacity. People are highly imitative, and if the Jewish advantage were purely cultural, such as hectoring mothers or a special devotion to education, there would be little to prevent others from copying it. Instead, given the new recognition of human evolution in the historical past, it is more likely that Jewish intellectual achievement has emerged from some pressure in their special history. Just as races have evolved in the recent past, ethnicities within races will also evolve if they are reproductively isolated to some extent from their host population, whether by geography or religion. The adaptation of Jews to a special cognitive niche, if indeed this has been an evolutionary process, as is argued below, represents a striking example of natural selection's ability to change a human population in just a few centuries. Until the era of rapid DNA sequencing, it could be surmised that Jews were a distinct population because of religious laws that frowned on marriage outside Judaism. But no one knew for certain because in the absence of genetic evidence, it was impossible to estimate the amount of intermarriage that might nevertheless have occurred throughout history. DNA analysis shows that Jews are a definable set of populations, and that Ashkenazi Jews at least can be distinguished genetically from other Europeans. With each Jewish community, there has been some intermarriage with local populations, but at a very slow rate. This neatly explains the observation by Jewish anthropologists that Jews from all over the world resemble one another yet also resemble their host populations. The basis of the common resemblance is that Jews originated in Israel and carry shared inheritance from the Semitic population of the region. As recently as 3,000 years ago, a date that marks the probable beginning of the Jewish religion, Jews were no different from anyone else. They were part of the general Near East population from which today's Arabs, Turks, and Armenians are also descended. But as soon as their religion started forbidding members to marry non-members, the Jewish population would have entered into reproductive isolation, much as if it had been placed on a remote island. Some large degree of reproductive isolation is the necessary condition for a population to take its own evolutionary path. As to European Jews, or Ashkenazim, genetics show that there has been a 5% to 8% admixture with Europeans since the founding of the Ashkenazi population in about 900 AD, which is equivalent to 0.05% per generation. Researchers using a SNP chip that tests the genome at 550,000 sites report that they were able to distinguish with complete accuracy between Ashkenazim and non-Jewish Europeans. This is a test applicable to populations, not individuals, since it depends on seeing how individuals cluster together in terms of statistical differences in their genome sequences. Still, it shows that Ashkenazim are a distinctive population and therefore could have been subjected to forces of natural selection different from those acting on other Europeans. Ashkenazim probably differ genetically from other Europeans because of the Near Eastern component in their ancestry. It is clear that the genomes of individuals with full Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry carry an unambiguous signature of their Jewish heritage, and this seems more likely to be due to their specific Middle Eastern ancestry than to inbreeding, the researchers say. The rate of admixture with host populations has probably been similar among the other two main Jewish populations. These are the Sephardim and the Oriental Jews, or Mizrahim. The Sephardim are Jews who had long lived in Spain and Portugal but were expelled from those countries in 1492 and 1497. They then dispersed around the Mediterranean to places like North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. Many Sephardim also settled in Holland. Oriental Jews are those who have long lived in Arab countries and Iran. The origin of the Sephardim is still obscure, but there are genetic hints that both they and the Ashkenazim may be offshoots of the large Jewish community that lived in Rome during the early Roman Empire. On genetic maps of the world's population, the three Jewish groups cluster together, sandwiched between the Middle Eastern populations with whom they share joint ancestry, and the European populations with which the Ashkenazim and Sephardim are admixed. Given this degree of genetic separation, it is perfectly possible for Jewish populations to have followed a slightly different evolutionary path from Europeans as they adapted to the special circumstances of their history and developed unusual cognitive abilities. Yet the idea that there could be meaningful genetic differences between human groups is fiercely resisted by many researchers. They cling to the idea that the mind is a blank slate on which only culture, not genetics, can write, and dismiss the possibility that evolution could have affected any recent change in the human mind. They reject the proposal that any human behavior, let alone intelligence, has a genetic basis. They make accusations of racism against anyone who suggests that cognitive capacities might differ between human population groups. All these positions are shaped by leftist and Marxist political dogma, not by science. Nonetheless, most scholars will not enter this territory from lively fear of being demonized by their fellow academics. A more substantive objection to exploring this issue has to do with sensitivities of the Jewish community. As with the Chinese immigrant communities in Asia, hard work and success has too often provoked the envy and enmity of their host populations, leading to discrimination, expulsions, and massacres. Discussion of Jewish intelligence carries the risk of stirring up hostility. But the days of pogroms are past, and to ignore every difficult subject would serve only the forces of obscurantism. The only serious recent attempt by researchers to delve into the links between Jewish genetics and intelligence is an extended essay by Gregory Cochran, Jason Hardy, and Henry Harpending of the University of Utah. Their report was submitted to several journal editors in the United States, all of whom said it was fascinating, but that they could not publish it. The authors eventually secured publication in England in the Journal of Biosocial Science. The essence of the Utah team's argument is to assert a causal connection between two unusual and otherwise unexplained facts. The first is that Ashkenazi Jews, in addition to their cultural achievements, have a high IQ, generally measured at between 110 and 115, which is the highest average of any ethnic group. The second is that Ashkenazim have a strange pattern of so-called Mendelian diseases, those that are caused by a mutation in a single gene. The Utah researchers note first that Ashkenazi IQ, besides being high, has an unusual structure. Of the components of IQ tests, Ashkenazim do well on verbal and mathematical questions, but score lower than average on visuospatial questions. In most people, these two kinds of ability are highly correlated. This suggests that some specific force has been at work in shaping the nature of Ashkenazi intelligence, as if the population were being adapted not to hunting, which requires excellent visuospatial skills, but to more urban occupations served by the ability to manipulate words and numerals. So it's striking to find that Ashkenazim, almost from the moment their appearance in Europe was first recorded, around 900 AD, were heavily engaged in moneylending. This was the principal occupation of Jews in England, France, and Germany. The trade required a variety of high-level skills, including the ability to read and write contracts and to do arithmetic. Literacy was a rare ability in medieval Europe. As late as 1500, only 10% of the population of most European countries was literate, whereas almost all Jews were. As for arithmetic, it may be simple enough with the Arabic numerals in use today, but Arabic numerals did not become widespread in Europe until the mid-16th century. Before that, people used Roman numerals, a notation system that has no zero. Calculating interest rates and currency swaps without the use of zero is not a straightforward computation. There were no banks in those days, and money lenders were essential for those who wished to buy on credit or engage in long-distance trade. The moneylender had to assess the creditworthiness of borrowers, appraise collateral, understand local contract law, and stay on good terms with the authorities who would enforce it. For those engaged in long-distance trade, in which physical transfer of money was generally avoided because of the danger, it was necessary to arrange credit with reliable partners in faraway cities. So it's easy enough to accept the Utah team's first premise, that Ashkenazi Jews of the Middle Ages were engaged in a cognitively demanding occupation. The second point is that this occupation, though highly risky, was also highly rewarding. In all the European countries in which they settled, Jews enjoyed high standards of living. Between 1239 and 1260, taxes paid by Jews contributed between 1/6 and 1/5 of royal revenues, even though Jews constituted 0.01% of the population. In 1241, Jews in Germany paid 12% of the entire imperial tax revenue. The wealth was important because it enabled Jews to secure a considerable degree of reproductive success. Before the Industrial Revolution and the escape from the Malthusian trap, the rich had more surviving children, being able to provide better nutrition and warmer houses. The Ashkenazi population had grown from almost nothing in 900 AD to about 500,000 people by 1500 AD, and had reached 14.3 million by 1900 AD. Ashkenazim were concentrated in a few professions, notably moneylending and later tax farming. Give the prince his money up front, then extract the taxes due from his subjects. Because of the strong heritability of intelligence, the Utah team calculates that 20%. Generations, a mere 500 years, would be sufficient for Ashkenazim to have developed an extra 16 points of IQ above that of Europeans. The Utah team assumes that the heritability of intelligence is 0.8%, meaning that 80% of the variance, the spread between high and low values in a population, is due to genetics. If the parents of each generation have an IQ of just 1 point above the mean, then average IQ increases by 0.8% per generation. If the average human generation time in the Middle Ages was 25 years, then in 20 human generations, or 500 years, Ashkenazi IQ would increase by 20 times 0.8% equal to 16 IQ points. There were, of course, Christian moneylenders who required the same cognitive skills as Ashkenazim. But the Christians married into a much larger community that included people in many other occupations. Natural selection may have been raising the intelligence of urban populations in general during the Middle Ages, but exerted a much stronger effect on the smaller Jewish population. This was because any intelligence-enhancing genes that arose in a family in the general population would be diluted in the next generation, but could accumulate in the Jewish community because marriage to outsiders was deterred. This selective effect could not operate on Oriental Jews, those under Muslim rule, because their rulers for the most part confined them to unpopular occupations like tanning or butchery, which required no particular intellectual skills. Oriental Jews and Sephardim are not overrepresented in cognitively demanding occupations, and both have IQs comparable to Europeans, the Utah team says. The Utah researchers give short shrift to the other explanations that have been proposed for enhanced Jewish intelligence. One is that the series of massacres and expulsions that began at the time of the First Crusade in 1096 constituted a selective effect that only the more intelligent were able to survive. But the massacres and expulsions affected the whole Ashkenazi population and seem unlikely to have selected the more intelligent nearly as precisely as did the skills required for moneylending. Jewish folklore holds that marriages between the children of rabbis and rich merchants were the driver of enhanced intelligence. Talmudic academies, writes the anthropologist Melvin Connor, culled the best minds in every generation of Jews for more than 1,000 years. Rising stars among these bright young men would board with successful merchants, and matches would be made between them and the merchants' daughters. Thus the smartest, most studious boys would join the wealthiest families. 10. Without any data as to how often such matches were made, this seems more like a scholar's fantasy than a common arrangement. Rich merchants may have been more likely to see another merchant's son as a more promising son-in-law than a poor rabbinical student. But even if such marriages did sometimes occur, there were not enough rabbis in the population, a mere 1%, to make a genetically significant difference, the Utah team says. The Utah researchers make a plausible enough general case that the selective pressure from a cognitively demanding occupational niche would have selected for higher intelligence among Ashkenazim. They then go on to identify what they believe are the causative genes. Their proposals, if confirmed, would give specific plausibility to the general argument, but, if false, would not bring it down. The genetic argument concerns the mutations that cause Mendelian diseases. Mendelian, or simple diseases, are those that result from a mutation that disables a single gene, as opposed to complex diseases like cancer or diabetes, which are the product of several causative variant genes. Every population has its own pattern of Mendelian diseases. Among Jews, some Mendelian mutations like familial Mediterranean fever are very ancient, being shared with other Middle Eastern populations like Turks and Druze, while others are found among only Ashkenazim or Sephardim, and so must have occurred after the two populations separated. The Utah team's analysis focuses on a group of 4 Mendelian diseases that occur in Ashkenazim and affect an obscure biochemical function, the storage of fats known as sphingolipids. The 4 diseases are known as Tay-Sachs, Gaucher's, Niemann-Pick, and mucolipidosis type IV. Inheriting a single copy of any of these variant genes does no great harm. The good copy inherited from the other parent compensates for the defective allele. But inheriting a double dose of the variant alleles can cause serious impairment in the case of Gaucher's and is lethal in the case of the other 3 diseases. The variant genes that cause the 4 diseases are found in relatively high proportions in the Ashkenazi population. When a version of gene is more common than expected, geneticists usually assume one of 2 causes. One is natural selection, and the other is the influence known as a founder effect. Why should natural selection favor a variant gene associated with a lethal disease? This can happen when the variant, though lethal in a double dose, confers some advantage when inherited from only one parent. A well-known example is that of sickle cell anemia. A person with 1 copy of the variant gene is protected from malaria, but those who inherit 2 copies suffer from a serious blood disease. The allele will be favored by natural selection because the many single allele carriers who are protected from malaria far outnumber the carriers of 2 alleles who die or suffer impairment. The other reason why a variant gene can be more common than expected is that it happened to occur at high frequency in a small population that later expanded. Any rare mutation carried by one of the population's founders will be inherited by his or her descendants and attain a higher frequency in that population than in most others, a situation known as a founder effect. The geneticist Neil Risch has concluded that the Ashkenazi Jewish mutations are founder effects that arose around 1,000 years ago. Since the mutations all arose at the same time, they must have the same cause, and that must be a founder effect, Risch argues, because such a variety of mutations is unlikely to offer any specific advantage that natural selection might favor. But this argument is neatly turned around by the Utah team. They agree that the Ashkenazi mutations arose within the past 1,000 years, but argue that the mutations were indeed all favored by natural selection at the same time because they all promote intelligence. If the founder effect argument is rejected, a plausible reason for the commonness of Ashkenazi Mendelian mutations would be that they protect against some serious disease. But no such protective effect has yet been detected. In any case, Ashkenazi Jews and the European populations they lived among suffered from the same diseases, yet there is no similar pattern of mutations in Europeans. The only significant difference in the Ashkenazi way of life was that they worked in cognitively demanding occupations, the Utah team argues. So this must be the selective pressure that drove the Ashkenazi Mendelian mutations to such relatively high levels. Another reason for assuming natural selection is at work, rather than a founder effect, is that some of the Ashkenazi mutations occur in clusters. This is highly unusual because mutations strike at random throughout the genome, so should not be concentrated in genes that all have the same function. One set of Ashkenazi mutations occurs in the cluster of genes that controls the sphingolipid storage pathway mentioned above. For 4 mutations to be found in a specific pathway is a strong indication of natural selection. The Utah team points to experimental evidence, though there is not very much of it, suggesting that disruption of sphingolipid storage induces neurons to make more connections than usual. A second cluster of 4 mutations is found in a DNA repair pathway. 2 of the mutations occur in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes and are associated with breast and ovarian cancer. The other 2 mutations cause the diseases Fanconi's anemia type C and Bloom's syndrome. It is hard to see how disruptions of DNA repair systems could be beneficial in any context, especially in the case of the 2 BRCA mutations, which carry risk even when an individual has a single copy of the mutated gene. The Utah team notes that BRCA1 can limit cell proliferation in neuronal stem cells in the embryo and adult, so that impairing the gene could allow extra brain cells to be generated. They suggest there may be similar advantages yet to be discovered in the other DNA repair mutations. Though the exact role of the Mendelian mutations in promoting intelligence has yet to be clarified, they are strikingly common among Ashkenazim. Some 15% of Ashkenazi Jews carry one of the sphingolipid or DNA repair mutations, and 60% carry either these or one of the other Mendelian disease mutations special to Ashkenazim. As already noted, the mutations are harmless when inherited from just one parent. The Utah team's explanation seems the best so far for this strange pattern of mutations, and in particular for those that exist in clusters. Moreover, it is a great virtue in a scientific hypothesis to be easily testable, as the Utah team's theory is. The theory implies that people carrying one of the Ashkenazic mutations will be found to have higher IQ scores on average than people who do not. Anyone with access to a population of Ashkenazim could test the prediction that high IQ is associated with the Ashkenazic mutations. Strange to say, no one has yet done so, or if they have not published their findings. Without being able to test a living population, the Utah team obtained indirect evidence that Gaucher's disease raises IQ. They found that of 255 working-age patients at a Gaucher's clinic in Israel, 1/3 were in fields like science, accountancy, or medicine, which require high IQs, a far greater proportion than in the population as a whole. Advantages of literacy. A possible weakness of the Utah team's proposal is the assertion that enhanced cognitive capacity is confined to the Ashkenazic branch of the Jewish population. Sephardim have given the world Spinoza, Disraeli, Ricardo, and many other distinguished individuals. It is hard to find specific measurements of Sephardic IQ, and the Utah team offer none in their article. Measurements of IQ in Israel report that Ashkenazi IQ is higher than that of non-Ashkenazim, but the latter group includes Oriental Jews as well as Sephardim. The Utah team focuses on Ashkenazi Jews because the Mendelian mutations found in Ashkenazim seem to have originated around 1000 AD, after Ashkenazim and Sephardim became separate populations. But even if the Utah team's thesis has merit, there is no reason why Jews should not have enjoyed special cognitive capacities from much earlier in their history. If so, these traits could later have been enhanced among Ashkenazim in the manner the Utah team describes. A new perspective on Jewish history has recently been developed by two economic historians, Maristella Botticini and Zvi Eckstein. Botticini specializes in medieval contracts and marriage markets and teaches at Bocconi University in Milan. Eckstein is a distinguished economist who has served as deputy governor of the Bank of Israel. Their interest in Jewish history is focused on population numbers and occupation. They allude hardly at all to intelligence or genetics, yet their economic history makes abundantly clear how selection pressures could have acted on the Jewish population so as to enhance cognitive capacity. The widely held conventional explanation for Jewish occupational history is that Jews were forbidden by their Christian host nations to own land, and drifted into money lending because it was the only profession open to them. Because of frequent expulsions and persecutions, according to this view, Jewish communities were dispersed in towns all over Europe and the Mediterranean world. Botticini and Eckstein reject this explanation, arguing with a wealth of historical detail that Jews were not forced into money lending but rather chose it because it was so profitable, and that they generally dispersed not because of persecution but because there were jobs for only so many money lenders in each town. But how did Jews come to choose this unusual occupation? Botticini and Eckstein develop a simple but forceful explanation that goes back to the beginnings of rabbinical Judaism in the 1st century AD. Before the rabbinical era, Israelite religion was focused on the temple in Jerusalem and on copious animal sacrifices. Its leaders promoted 3 major insurrections against Roman rule, the first of which culminated in the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in 70 AD. The loss of the temple strengthened the position of the Pharisees, one of several sects, and led them to develop a quite different version of Judaism, in which the temple and animal sacrifice were replaced as central components of the religion by study of the Torah. The rabbinical form of Judaism that emerged from this movement emphasized literacy and the skills to read and interpret the Torah. Even before the destruction of the temple, the Pharisee high priest Joshua ben Gamla issued a requirement in 63 or 65 AD that every Jewish father should send his sons to school at age 6 or 7. The goal of the Pharisees was universal male literacy so that everyone could understand and obey Jewish laws. Between 200 and 600 AD, this goal was largely attained as Judaism became transformed into a religion based on study of the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, and the Talmud, a compendium of rabbinic commentaries. This remarkable educational reform was not accomplished without difficulty. Most Jews at the time earned their living by farming, as did everyone else. It was expensive for farmers to educate their sons, and the education had no practical value. Many seem to have been unwilling to do so because the Talmud is full of imprecations against the Amei Haaretz, which in Talmudic usage means boorish country folk who refuse to educate their children. Fathers are advised on no account to let their daughters marry the untutored sons of the Amei Haaretz. The scorned country folk could escape this hectoring without totally abandoning Judaism. They could switch to a form of Judaism light developed by a diaspora Jew, one that did not require literacy or study of the Torah and was growing in popularity throughout this period. The diaspora Jew was Paul of Tarsus, and Christianity, the religion he developed, seamlessly wraps Judaism around the mystery cult creed of an agricultural vegetation god who dies in the fall and is resurrected in the spring. As evidence that many Jews did indeed convert to Christianity, Bottacini and Eckstein cite estimates showing that the Jewish population declined dramatically from around 5.5 million in 65 AD to a mere 1.2 million in 650 AD. There is little else to account for such a dramatic decline other than a high rate of conversion away from Judaism. Bottacini and Eckstein make no mention of the genetic forces that would have been brought into play by such a conversion. But if Jews who lacked the ability or commitment to become literate were shed from the community generation after generation, the propensity for literacy of those remaining would steadily rise. The rabbinical requirement for universal male literacy may thus have been the first step toward a genetic enhancement of Jewish cognitive capacity. A second step was to come later, when the literacy was put to great practical effect. By 650 AD, Jews had almost entirely disappeared from regions where Christianity was strong, including Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and even Israel itself. The center of the Jewish world shifted to Iraq and Persia. There was also a shift in Jewish occupations. Jews abandoned farming and moved to towns, where they entered trade and commercial activities or became shopkeepers and artisans. After the establishment of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 AD, Jews migrated to the newly prospering towns and cities. By 900 AD, almost all Jews were engaged in urban occupations, dealing with crafts, trade, moneylending, and medicine. Why did Jews choose professions in these particular fields? Common belief is they were forbidden to own land and denied entry to certain crafts. Bottacini and Eckstein say there is little or no evidence for such prohibitions. Jews concentrated in professions like trade and moneylending, they argue, for a simple reason. In a world where most people were illiterate, the literacy of almost all Jews gave them a decided advantage in any occupation that required reading contracts or keeping accounts. Jews enjoyed another practical benefit conferred by their religion. Jewish communities were subject to law, as laid out in the Talmud, and rabbinic courts oversaw contract enforcement and disputes. Because of the presence of Jewish communities in many cities of Europe and the Near East, Jews had access to a natural trading network of their co-religionists. Both the network and the dispute resolution mechanism were unusual and gave Jews a special advantage in long-distance commerce. As trade and urbanization started to flourish in the Muslim world under the Abbasids, the higher literacy of the Jewish people, Bottacini and Eckstein write, gave the Jews a comparative advantage over non-Jews in crafts, trade, commerce, and money lending. 13. The sack of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258 destroyed the political and cultural center of the Abbasid Empire, and large regions of Iraq and Persia became depopulated. The population center of the Jewish community now shifted to Europe, where Jews increasingly specialized in money lending. This occupational pattern had a profound demographic consequence. Because money lending was so profitable, despite its high risks, Jews could afford to support large families and, like other wealthy people, could ensure that more of their children survived to adulthood. After the devastation of the Jewish communities in Iraq and Persia, and the expulsion of European Jews from England, France, and many regions of Germany, their total population fell to fewer than 1 million in 1500 AD. But propelled by their new wealth, the Jewish population started to increase rapidly and by 1939 had reached 16.5 million globally. From an evolutionary perspective, the population increase was the result of a successful adaptation. Because of the requirement for literacy, Jews found themselves better able than non-Jews to cope with the new cognitive demands of urban commerce. Jews had the behavioral traits conducive to success in a capitalist society, writes the historian Jerry Z. Muller. They entered commercializing societies with a stock of know-how from their families and communities about how markets work, about calculating profit and loss, about assessing and taking risks. Most important, though hardest to specify, Jews demonstrated a propensity for discovering new wants and to bringing underused resources to market. 14. Like Chinese immigrant communities, Jews have brought enormous benefits to the economies in which they worked. Unfortunately, their success, like that of the immigrant Chinese, has in many cases elicited not gratitude but envy, followed by discrimination or murderous reprisals, a response that reflects more strongly on the greed than the intelligence of their host populations. From a glance at an Eskimo's physique, it is easy to recognize an evolutionary process at work that has molded the human form for better survival in an Arctic environment. Populations that live at high altitudes, like Tibetans, represent another adaptation to extreme environments. In this case, the changes in blood cell regulation are less visible, but have been identified genetically. Of Jews to capitalism is another such evolutionary process, though harder to recognize because the niche to which Jews are adapted is one that has required a behavioral change, not a physical one. Because of this adaptation, the Jewish population includes proportionately more individuals of higher cognitive capacity than do most others. It thus punches above its weight in endeavors requiring high intelligence. Traits like intelligence are distributed in the shape of a bell, with large numbers of people having the average value and progressively fewer as one moves toward either the higher or lower extreme. It takes only a slight upward shift in the average value to yield significantly more at the upper extreme. Average Northern European IQ is 100, by definition, and 4 people per 1,000 in such a population would be expected to have IQs above 140 points. But among Ashkenazim, if the average IQ is taken as 110, then 23 Ashkenazim per 1,000 should exceed 140, the Utah team calculates, a proportion almost 6 times greater than that in Northern Europe. This helps explain why the Jewish population, despite its small size, has produced so many Nobel Prize winners and others of intellectual distinction.